the Instructor Podcast with Terry Cook, talking with leaders, innovators, experts and game changers about what drives them.
Welcome to the Instructor Podcast. This is a show where I help you become an even better driving instructor and run a better driving school business. As always, I am your slightly annoying host, Terry Cook, and I'm delighted to be even more delighted that you have chosen to listen, because we are continuing our dive into all things road safety and looking to bridge that gap between driving instructors and the road safety sector. And I'm delighted to say the season sponsor is Bright Coaching. To find out more about Bright Coaching, what they have to offer, and their professional diploma for driving instructors, head over to brightcoaching.net. But on to today's episode, I am joined by Ian.Edwards, who was a driving instructor for over 15 years and is now an independent researcher, and is also one of the people behind the Hermes project. Now, if you haven't heard of the Hermes project before, we do cover it on today's episode, but that is a project that introduced client-centered learning into our driving instructor world. So we talk about that and client-centered learning, and we look at the SAFE system and a whole heap of other things as well. And thoroughly enjoyed this episode, really enjoyed talking to Ian. He definitely opened my eyes on some things I've not considered before and connected some dots for me, which is great. But just before we get into the episode, this is usually a part of the show where I ask you to click subscribe or go and check out the Instructor Podcast Premium or something like that, but I'm not doing that today, because this episode is going out on Sunday, the 19th of May, and it's the end of the Road Peace Challenge. Now, the Road Peace Challenge is aiming to basically honour the 1,766 people that died on UK roads in 2022. And here at the Instructor Podcast, we've been trying to raise money for that. So I would really appreciate it if you could spare a few quid to go and donate. Now, you can find a link to this in the show notes. You'll find it in the accompanying email for the show. You'll find it on the website blog. You'll find it on social media. I don't care where you find it. I'd just really love it if you had a spare fiver or whatever you can spare, go and donate it to Road Peace. If you aren't sure about Road Peace Do, you can go back and check out episode 1 of this season. We cover it in detail there with Rebecca Morris. But it's a really remarkable charity, massively underfunded, and the work they do is really important. And you know, what charity can we get that's more connected to what we do than Road Peace? And yeah, like I said, I know this is a point where I normally point to the Instructor Podcast Premium, but if you've got a choice today between signing up for the Premium and investing your money there or donating to Road Peace, go and give it to Road Peace. Just for this week. Sign up to me next week. But, you know, go and donate to Road Peace. You know, I would really appreciate that, and they will as well. So you can find more information at roadpeace.org, or, as I say, check the links in the show notes. But it's the end of the challenge. We've been walking 5 miles a day trying to raise money from, and yeah, if you've donated it already, thank you. If you haven't and you're going to, thank you. If you can't, don't worry, completely understand it. But for now, let's get stuck into the show. Today on the Instructor Podcast, I am joined by Ian.Edwards, who, amongst other things, is a former ADI, is a current independent road safety researcher and practitioner, and he was part of the Hermes project that led us to our client-centered learning. How are we doing, Ian?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for asking me along, Terry. Looking forward to having a chat with you. Yeah.
I'm delighted to have you on board and picking your brain. We've got some fun stuff to talk about today, but I want to start off with the ADI bit, because I'm fascinated about someone who started in my world, in our world of the ADI, and is now doing what you're doing. So just want to tell us a little bit about your time as an ADI, you know, maybe how long you served, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I suppose we could go back a little bit further, but I'm ex-army originally. So and my skill set in the army was basically driving trucks. So when I during that period, I'd started to help out a little bit on the driver training side and sort of upgrading people mainly from class 3 to class 2 and occasionally from class 2 to class 1. And then when I left the army, it just seemed like an appropriate move. I didn't really know what I was going to do. So I, like lots of people, sort of fell into driving instruction in that way. So I trained as a driving instructor. Was an active driving instructor for about 15, 16 years. So, you know, quite a long time. I held my badge a lot longer than that. I held it, a good 20 plus years. I've only just fairly recently let it completely lapse. I thoroughly enjoyed my time as an ADI. I started off teaching learners, and then moved across more into instructor training. So I was a sort of ADI trainer when there wasn't many people training ADIs at that time, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. And that started to make me think a little bit more about how people learn, how people retain information. I became quite interested in learning theory, the theories of how people learn and develop, and started to do quite a lot of reading around that. And I've just found the whole area really, really interesting. My next step then came when, for various reasons, I decided I wanted to do something a little bit different. And a job came up in Doncaster, which is where I now live, as a road safety officer. So I moved across to be a road safety officer in Doncaster for a relatively short time. I probably only did that for about a year. That was a general road safety officer, and that was, again, really interesting because you were training children, you were doing cycle training at the time, you were training wheelchair users, which was absolutely fascinating. I got quite embedded in one of the schools here, who had a lot of children with, all the children had special educational needs. I started doing a lot of work with them, and a lot of that was around wheelchair training. And actually, the skills of a driving instructor are really quite transferable into that. You still do you keep and creep between parked cars, if you can't see, and all of that. So I did that for probably about a year, and then a management job came up in Huddersfield as the head of the driver improvement schemes, as they're called there, and I covered both South and West Yorkshire. So I had a big patch, had lots of driving instructors involved in that. Two distinct groups actually, one in South Yorkshire and one in West Yorkshire, and I did that for about 5 years, and that was really interesting. And then I progressed on. So I can talk more about that, but that takes you up to that point.
It's interesting. I'm a fellow Yorkshireman. You in working in the best area in Yorkshire, so that's good. But what made you come out with that then and come more into the road safety sector?
I think the more I got involved, the more I realised there was more to road safety than just driver education and training. That's a really important aspect to it, but there is more to the whole idea of road safety, and it's a much broader spectrum than I think most people recognise. And I found it fascinating, and the more you got into it, the more you begin to get absorbed by the subject. And every time I think, I've got a pretty good handle on that, something else will come along, So for a long time it was, lots of psychology, and then it was neurology. In there somewhere there was the thought processes that were developing around hazard perception and the different phases of hazard perception. So the more I sort of dug, the more I dug myself into a wider spectrum and wanting to know more. I don't think I've got many sort of gifts, but I do have a curiosity. So I do like to sort of, know why something works, not just that it works. So I think that's what drew me out of driver training and driver education into a wider road safety. But it wasn't a straight step. I went from, sort of being a very active driving instructor to this very short time in what I will call it general road safety role, which was more of a training role, and then into this management role where really I was still very much using my driving instructor skills, to develop the driver improvement schemes. I was very involved in the development of the speed awareness schemes, and we ran some pilots in Kirklees, which is Huddersfield, assessing them and looking at them. So I did. It wasn't a quick move. I sort of drifted across from roads, from being an ADI into this wider role where we were sort of delivering the driving improvement schemes. That led me to some really good projects and a chance meeting. I know you wanted to talk about this, so I'll keep going. I met when I pretty much first day on the job in the driver improvement scheme. I got a phone call from somebody who asked if they could come out and see one of the schemes because they were interested in tendering for a DFT, Department for Transport, funded project to evaluate the impact of the driver improvement schemes. This lady, Julie, arrived, and she was a doctor from the Institute of Transport Studies, which is part of Leeds University. We got on very well, very nice. She was saying, well, what's your plans to improve it? And I did have a plan to improve it. And it was about showing them some pictures because video was a bit of a stretch, and getting them to think about what information there was on the courses, and there was in that picture that it would be useful to a driver. She sort of said, "Oh, how are you going to evaluate this?" And I sort of, well, we'll just put it in and see how it goes, And she looked at me, appalled, right? She said, "Leave that with me." And I always thought she was going to come up with some evaluation plan. And she rang me back about 2 weeks later and said, "Oh, by the way, I booked you onto a master's at Huddersfield University starting about 3 months." And that was me stepping to sort of the academic side. So I sort of had my arm put up my back and was sent on to a master's at Huddersfield looking at research and evaluation, social research and evaluation. So I passed that. And that really did open the doors, to a world I didn't know existed. So it was a chance meeting.
I want to touch back on something you said earlier, actually. You said about kind of when you started getting into this sector and you started digging into it and finding different avenues and stuff. I found the same, obviously not to your scale, but over the past 6 months, I've really been digging into the road safety. And it's like Alice going down the rabbit hole, isn't it? It's like there's all these different fascinating people and there's so much more to it. And I would you encourage ADIs to start going down that rabbit hole a bit? And because there's loads of different avenues that you can latch on. So would you encourage ADIs to get a bit more involved?
Yeah, I would. And again, one of the things we discussed possibly talking about, and we might come back to it, so I can sort of deal with it now, or we can come back later. But it's important, I think, to be, I look back at what I was like as a driving instructor. So we're going back to mainly the 90s, and I'm appalled at my lack of knowledge of, I knew the laws, I knew the rules, I knew, but I didn't know the big picture, and the more you dig, the more big picture you can see, the more you start to understand how the very important role that driving instructors have fits into that bigger picture and how they can influence that bigger picture. And at the moment, we're sort of casing all that into a concept called Vision Zero, which is an idea that really came out of Sweden, which is nobody should die or be seriously injured as a result of traveling from A to B roads network. And that was a stated aim by the Swedish government, sort of again in sort of mid 90s, I think. And they then had to try and make that happen. So they frantically looked around and they started to develop what is now called the Safe Systems approach. And it really finds its background in health and safety, but it sort of says that, you have to see a driver or a road user as part of a bigger system. And that system is really quite complex. And if somebody is injured or hurt, yes, they might have made a mistake, but the system has allowed them to make a mistake because it should almost be impossible to make a mistake. And if a mistake is made, well, we know that the human body can only withstand a certain amount of pressure on it. So there's no excuse for it to be catastrophic, because really there's something gone very badly wrong in that entire system. A, to allow the mistake to occur in the first place, and B, for it to be a catastrophic error. There should have been lots of other things to prevent that. And one of the best ways I've always sort of, there's two ways I always view that. There's a thing called the Swiss cheese model, which is, if you imagine you had lumps of Swiss cheese, they've got holes in, right? Well, basically, you shouldn't be, if you put lots and lots of Swiss cheese together, you shouldn't be able to push a pencil right through, because the chances of all the holes collecting up is pretty slim. But occasionally you do get those holes, and that's when a catastrophic incident occurs, right? So that's called the Swiss cheese model. I always think that's quite a nice way of looking at it. And from memory, I think that was done by a researcher called Jim Reason. And then the other one, which dates right back to the sort of 1700s, I think. There's a quotation, and it basically says, "To err is humane, to forgive is divine." Right? To err is humane, to forgive is divine. And basically, what that means is humans will always make mistakes. It's the most fundamental thing. So if we've got a system that doesn't prevent those mistakes happening, then that system's flawed, because we know humans will make mistakes, right? And by mistakes, it might be a deliberate act. It might be, we make a misjudgment. We do something wrong on a particular day. Somebody jumps the fence on a pedestrian barrier. They're all errors. They're all mistakes. To forgive is divine is that the system should have enough of those bits of Swiss cheese, so it's very hard for it to become catastrophic. And when you start thinking about road safety like that, you begin to see that bigger picture, that there's lots and lots of different elements to it. But still at the basis of it, your human's still an important element of that system.
I like how you explain that, because it's something that I come up against a lot with other ADIs, not all, but a lot of ADIs, that when I talk about collisions being preventable, you get, well, not every collision is preventable. We get this, but for me, it's like, if it's two people, one in one car, one in the other, one of them's going to have caused that, potentially, if it's a physical human error. But then, as you were saying, if a human makes an error, well, the car should be safe enough to prevent it becoming catastrophic. But if the road is safe, and if the speed was safe, so even if it then does become a bad error and something else goes wrong, we've then also got the post-crash care. So it's not just about the human errors. It's like you said, the humans will make the mistakes, but it's all the other things that go around it that prevent that mistake from becoming catastrophic.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, vehicles are a really good example of that. So the safe system, right in the middle of it, sort of has this idea of, the system should prevent the error occurring in the first place, right? Ideally. But if it does occur, it shouldn't become catastrophic. So vehicles are a very good example of that. So we have active and passive safety systems now on vehicles. So an active system is something that prevents the collision occurring in the first place. So emergency braking, for example, where the car stops in front of you, driver doesn't brake, the car instigates a brake for you, that type of approach. So that's an active system that prevents the collision occurring. And then you've got the passive system, the passive safety systems that cut in once the collision has occurred to prevent it becoming catastrophic. Seatbelts, head restraints, side impact bars, crumple zones, all of those sorts of things. So you've got, that's a really good example. The vehicles are a really good example of where we're moving. Basically, they're usually called pillars or components, depending on your preference. But there's 5 pillars within the safe systems. The first one is a safe road user. So a road user needs to know how to use it, how to use the system, needs to know how the safety equipment works, needs to know the importance of wearing bright clothing on a night, etc., etc. So the safe road user. In driver training, education, well, need to know how the car operates, need to know the rules of the road, needs to understand their own personality and how that might influence their behavior, the types of journey they're going to undertake and the social setting. So there's a lot in that idea of safe road user. The next one round, we've got safe speeds. And safe speeds are really critical. Very small increases in speed make significant impacts in the outcome of the collision for 2 reasons. One, it increases the chances of the collision occurring because everybody has less time to react, so not just the driver, we're talking about a pedestrian outside the car or whatever. And the forces involved are much greater, and disproportionately greater. Hence, we have braking distances which are times by 4, you double the speed. So speed is absolutely critical in that process, because that dictates the number of collisions in many ways and also the impact that you've got. So you've got safe speeds. So quite often that's engineering. It's about putting speed limits up. It's about making the road feel that this is a safe speed. It's about, lots of other things. Then you've got safe roads and roadsides. So I've touched slightly on that. Roadsides I always think is interesting. So for an example of a passive safety device at a roadside might be, if you come off the road and you hit a barrier, such as a road sign, why doesn't the barrier collapse? Because that would take the sting out of the collision. That makes sense. So if you imagine going around a right-hand bend, you could have chevrons which collapsed on impact, rather than a hard metal sign that says go around to the right and you've got stuck in concrete with two great big forces on it, So that's about an engineering type measure to make the roadsides better, road treatments, high friction surfaces, improve the road as well. Safe vehicles I've already talked about. And then as you've touched on, you've got your post-crash care. So how quickly can somebody who's involved in a collision, get the help that they need, whether or not that's sort of first aid or professional care. I did a sort of a project a few years ago in Jordan. Which, I went to Amman, which is their capital city, and there they have really poor pedestrian infrastructure, very narrow pavements, very high pavements, and quite often it means that pedestrians are walking on the road because they're very narrow, and so they have quite a high pedestrian casualty figures. But more concerning was when I was there teaching something, I looked out the window and there was an ambulance sort of parked that I could see. Blue lights were going. The guys were eating their sandwiches, just parked up because there was nowhere to go. So post-crash care might be excellent when you get to the hospital, but it could be a long time before an ambulance gets there because there's no options to get that ambulance around the sort of traffic jam. And I'm sure that's a problem in some parts of the UK as well. But that's what we mean by post-crash care. How good is the care and how quickly can you access it? And we're very lucky in the UK generally.
Do you know what? Loads of interesting stuff there, but I want to go back to one of the early things you said about the pedestrian and the speeding car, because the way you'd phrase that, I don't think I'd really connected the dots with that before. In that, if we're speeding, whether that's breaking the speed limit or going too fast to what's appropriate, if a pedestrian then makes a mistake and steps out perhaps when they shouldn't, as you said, they then got less time to react to that. And maybe this, I don't know whether I've been daft not connecting those dots before, but I've just not thought of it that way. So it's interesting how it all connects together. And with this safe system, as I think you touched on, like ADIs primarily work around the safe road users aspect. That's where we're kind of embedded, but we're not limited to that, are we? So how could we develop or work in those other aspects of the safe system, do you think?
Well, I mean, probably the most obvious one is one you've just touched on there is to, and I'm sure you do this as well in your role, and ADIs do it, but is getting people to recognize that when they're driving a car, it's just not about what they're doing, it's what other people are going to do. It's about you're all working in the same system, and you're likely to make a mistake, but so is everybody else on the road. And actually, if you are breaking the speed limit, you're narrowing down your safety margins for reaction, and you're narrowing down their safety options to be able to recover from a mistake that they've made. And that's very important that speed is probably, out of the safe systems idea, speed is probably the underpinning bit. If I was pushed, it's all important. But if the theme that runs through it is, slower you go, less likely to have a collision, much more survivable if you do, not just for you, but for everybody else around you. So speed is a very critical element of that safe system. But there's a lot, so it's about getting your drivers, as ADIs, to think about how does this fit in that wider system. Another example might be, Norway, for example, they saw a significant reduction in their deaths and casualties as they move much more to dual carriageway and motorway type roads, because you just cut down traffic cutting across and all of that. So where people sort of feel, that's a long way to go and do a U-turn, a set of traffic lights to come back up the way, That's usually a hell of a lot safer than trying to turn right across traffic, coming towards you. Human vision is incredibly limited from the point of speed, particularly in what's called a zoom, a looming perspective. So looming is when you're turning right and the car in front of you is getting bigger. It's looming up in front of you as it's getting closer. And we use that looming to sort of inform at what point we can turn. Once you get about 50 miles an hour, that car, you're really struggling to know how fast that vehicle is coming towards you. So turning right across dual carriageway, is a very dangerous thing to do if it's got a high speed limit on it. So it's much safer to go down a bit and do a U-turn and come back up, at traffic lights, for example. So it's about getting them to understand the other components of the system. And for ADIs to do that, they probably need to understand the bigger picture. Again, this idea of a bigger picture. So I always, before I sort of did my first qualification in road safety, so not my master's, I did an earlier one called I forgot what it's called. Diploma in Traffic Accident and Safety Management, and a mental block there. I wasn't familiar with a form called the Stat 19. So for your listeners, the Stat 19 is a form that a police officer will fill in either at the scene of a collision or at the or when a collision is reported to them in the police station, for example. And that Stat 19 then works its way through to local councils, and Stat 19 informs a huge amount of remedial measures that go into a road, because it enables them to look at a particular junction and think, right, we've had X number of collisions there over this number of period of time, or down this length of road, we've had X number of collisions down this. So what can we do to reduce those collisions? So sometimes some of the things you see going in, you might think, well, I don't know why they're bothered with that. So for example, chevron markings down the middle of the road makes the road feel a bit narrower. Because it makes the road feel a bit narrower, people go slower. Naturally tend to drop the speed. Depending on the road type you're looking at, but a 1% reduction in speed usually leads to somewhere around about 5% reduction in casualties. So just small changes in speed make a massive difference. But unless you understand that actually that remedial action that the local council have put in is based on that data, then you can go, oh, why have they done that? And that then means as an ADI, you can't necessarily always give the full picture. Oh, interesting that they're using a stop sign here. Perhaps there's been more collisions here than there have been at other roads, and they've changed it from a give way to a stop because they want you to make a pronounced stop in order to have a good look before you emerge out the junction, etc. But unless you understand that big picture of how that data feeds through and ends up being used by traffic engineers, you've missed out that nuance.
I wanted to ask you about that stat because I'd not heard that stat before. So 1% decrease in speed results in a 5% decrease
depending on the road type.
Yeah.
That was some work done by KRL. It's quite an old stat, but usually a 1%. A 1 mile per hour reduction reduces in its. Sorry, I might have said that wrong. So 1 mile an hour reduction in mean speeds tends to produce somewhere in around about a 5% reduction in KSI.
I think that's one of them stats that I'm going to remember because every now and again you get a stat that just clicks with you and it impacts you. But when you're saying that, my students take mick out of me because I get excited quite easily about stuff. So when I see a change in road layout or difference in road markings or a change in speed from 30 to 20, I get really excited. And I'm like, let's go do this down by your street because they've done this, and let's take mick out of it. But I'm always like, why? And I ask them, why do you think you've done it? We may not always know the answer, but do you think getting students thinking about that, getting our learners saying, why do you reckon they've changed it? Do you think that's a good way to go in those situations?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you can tie it back to some of the background information that, that this would have come through probably from Stat 19 reports, this would have been looked at over a number of years, and this may have led to these changes. It's not the only reason which the traffic engineers will change things. There can be lots of reasons, but certainly what we would call remedial measures, they're very much led by Stat 19. when I started on the road safety side, I was in the department who looked at Stat 19s. I didn't personally, but I was a member of the management team, so we used to talk about them a lot. And at first, for many years we used to look for cluster sites, places where there were a junction where there was lots of collisions, hopefully fairly minor, but and then we would put remedial measures into that. Increasingly, though, we've had to start looking, or traffic engineers have had to start looking at what's called route treatments, where there's just a long road where there's specific collisions, so they've had to do sort of longer measures rather than just something at a junction, because hopefully the majority, although they always change and it's a bit of a moving feast, but most of the junctions that you could do something with fairly inexpensively have probably been treated multiple times, to be honest, to try and reduce their collisions, because they would have been spotted quite early. So cluster sites are a bit rarer now. What tends to happen is more sort of route treatments, so a reduction on the speed limit of a certain road, or something of that nature. So they tend to be a little bit more wide ranging. But understanding that, the other thing I don't think people appreciate is, there's generally a number given to a collision. What used to be called a highway economic note, just in the jargon, and that used to sort of, say 1.3 million for a driver, a fatal, and what would happen is we would use those types of numbers. We tended to use the all casualty number, which is a lot less than that, and we would think, how much would it cost to actually change that junction to make a real impact on that? And then we would look at what we would expect as a first year rate of return. So how many collisions would we save, and therefore how much money will we save against how much we spend? And that was one of the ways of prioritizing the types of interventions we would put in and where we would put them in. So again, it's a really interesting field, road safety, because it's just fast, and it does impact on, does come down to money. It does come down to sort of economics, as well as, the pure safety benefit. Because as an engineer once said to me, it's easy to make every road safe, close it, but, we want people to move, and therefore we have to make them move. And that leads us back into the safe systems, because what we've moved away from that a little bit, because now we're trying to think, right, what multiple layers of protection can we put in rather than just a single intervention? What else can we do other than just driver training or whatever that intervention might look like? What other sort of things like collapsible signs? So if a driver does make a mistake, there's less likely to become catastrophic. Lane segregation between different road user types, is another one often used. And it's all about layers of protection rather than just sort of a simple improve the sight line or that sort of nature.
Do you think a lot of the negativity towards this stuff comes from almost a selfishness? So, for example, I've never run anyone over on this road, so, why should this be in place? And I want to get to work on time, so the fact that this road's been reduced to a 20 is annoying. Or the recent one I can think of is the prioritising of pedestrians at junctions, and people, well, why should I have to stop for a pedestrian? They should stop for me. Do you think a lot of it comes from that almost selfishness of this is affecting me now, rather than the greater good, the bigger picture that you were talking about?
Yeah, but, and particularly where we're used to doing something over a long period, we tend to be quite resistant to change. So 30 30-mile an hour limits, have always been used. We've always accepted them as being an acceptable level. I don't know how much science there is behind a 30-mile an hour limit. I've got no idea where that number came from. I've got no idea why we're using that number. It's just the number that we've all always accepted in certain areas, an urban area, that's the speed limit, and obviously it's quite often way too fast for the prevailing road conditions, as a limit. I always used to teach a bit of a concept. I don't know how right or wrong this is, but I used to teach, 30s and slow 30s. right? So 30 was a road, fairly major, where you would expect the traffic to be coming down 30, the little side streets that were 30 miles an hour, well, they were slow 30s, and 2025 is probably more than fast enough down there, So, there's definitely, I don't know where the science has come around 30 miles an hour. What I do know is that 20 miles an hour, make a big difference if you hit a pedestrian. It's such a difference between hitting them at 30 plus and hit them at 20, to their survival, and therefore, to the outcome for the driver as well. The driver is not going to be in a good place if they had seriously injured somebody. They are going to feel mortified about that. Whether or not whose fault it may be or whatever, but they're going to feel mortified at that. Whereas if they, there's much less chance of having to have those emotions, that regret, if you lower your speeds. So it's about, again, selling the benefits. I'm currently doing a PhD at Sheffield University, and I was at the university yesterday presenting something. Somebody who works in there, I don't know what department it would be, engineering department. He came up afterwards and he sort of said, I'm working in autonomous vehicles. That's my area, and he sort of said, why wouldn't people want to use autonomous vehicles? And I said, well, they want control, they like control, they're used to control. Yes, but it's going to be safer and it's going to be, more productive because you won't have to, you'll be able to do other things. And I said, well, if you're going to sell it to people, you've got to sell it on that because it's not as straightforward as you think. And the other example I would give is seatbelts. We introduced, seatbelt came into vehicles in the 70s, and 80s, 70s, but it was only, I think from memory, sort of the 80s, 81, maybe 70s, 79, when it became compulsory to wear a seatbelt in the front. And that was resisted by government, actually, it took years and years to get that legislation through Parliament and several readings before it was accepted. And now very few people don't wear a seatbelt. Seatbelt wearing rates have remained in around about 90% ever since because it's just obvious. But there was this backlash, and there was lots in the papers about, the dangers of wearing a seatbelt, and everybody would have a story of somebody who said, oh, the policeman told me if I'd been wearing my seatbelt, I wouldn't have survived that crash and all of it. And we're going through that sort of process again, One of the areas I'm looking at, areas of research I'm doing at the moment is ISA, so intelligent speed assistance. If you want to look it up online, the research on it, you want to sort of Google intelligent speed assistance and intelligent speed. Oh, that'll come back to me in a moment. They used to have the A standing for something else. Anyway, it's now called intelligent speed assistance. What that does is it reads the speed limit. It sort of uses a combination of, some systems use a combination of GPS and cameras, and it can either give you a visual warning, it can give you a sort of an auditory warning, or it can actually intercede in the engine and reduce the power going to the vehicle to slow the car down. So you've got different versions of. They're all one version, but the driver can select what they want. That's going to be like seatbelts because most people probably won't use the system, I don't think. But in years to come, once the system is in there, at some point it'll become law because, it's really important that we obey the speed limits, So that's probably perhaps the new seatbelt area that's developing. We had to get seatbelts in first. We had to get people to agree, oh, that's a good idea. And then eventually we had a law that said, right, we'll put them on. And we've probably got to do the same with a lot of the new automated technologies that are coming through. ISA is probably the first one that can do that because, I'm not convinced how many people will actually decide to use an ISA system if they've got the option of turning it off or overriding it by firmly pressing the accelerator. So it'll be interesting to see how that unpacks a little bit.
But again, I think that's where it falls into driving instructors. You spoke about safe speeds there. You're kind of talking about the safer vehicles. These are the things that we can bring into lessons. The safe speeds are easily conversations we should be having, not just could be having. But bringing in this, the stuff in the car. So whether it's just cruise control is a really good place to start, or whatever it is. So, is that where we can come in? Do we as instructors really need to actually not say anymore, we can do this, but actually start doing it?
I think that's a really good point, particularly around, just generally. I think ADIs have always sort of talked about the dangers of speed, but selling the benefits of new technology is really important, right? Because the new technology fits into that safe systems. ISA is there as an active safety device. It will read the speed limit, and if you've got it turned on fully, it will slow you down. It only reduces the power going to the engine. It doesn't put the brakes on, so it just brings you down. And that just means that, abeyance with speed limits, it should, over the next few years be, in theory, 100%. Probably take about 10 years, 15 years to reach that. But that's the new technology that's coming in. And the more we sell it and the more we get people using it, the more accepted of it they will be, and that's a real role for ADIs. They've got a really important aspect there to sort of think about, and implement. These new safety technologies. It will be very easy to sort of say, well, I don't need to teach that. That's not necessarily important, but they need to get used to using them. Because I have some concerns at the moment around this move from very little automation on vehicles to increasing automation on vehicles. Because although the vehicles will be automated, pedestrians and cyclists and everybody else around you won't be.
Yeah.
And also, whilst we transition from very little automation to high degrees of automation, it'll be very easy to use that automation in a poor way. So I've got lane assist on mine. It's really important that I know where the lane assist button is to turn it off, because I live in a fairly rural area, and lane assist pretty much tries to put me in a ditch. So I need to know when to turn it off and when it's good. Great on motorways. It'll warn me if I've, got distracted or whatever. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But great on motorways. Perhaps not so good on very narrow little country lanes. So you need to know how to turn these systems on and off, because if you just drive with them on, you get used to them, but you don't necessarily recognize when they've got limitations.
I think that's a great shout. And again, I think it's where we can come in. The more we can help learners understand what this stuff is and that they can switch on and off, to use your example. Well, when they get their own car, that's hopefully, not all the time, it can't affect everyone, but hopefully going to be in the forefront of the brain. I made a brilliant example the other day. One dual carriage where students got cruise control on, doing 70, and he just took his hands off the wheel, like just let him hover over the wheel side. And what are you doing with your hands? He went, I'm testing your lane assist. I'm not sure it was the best thing to do, but it's kind of hovering the wheel and just letting the car drift outside. And I thought, how good is it that he's thinking that?
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily sure about the application, but it's great that he's using that lesson to practice that.
At least he's aware of it, but again, that's a limitation of it, or potential limitation. That's the sort of concerns that I have around sort of the application of these systems when they first start, that people will start experimenting with them, and that is a concern. So it is important that they understand that, that might keep you in the lane, but if somebody suddenly sort of cuts across, you still need to be in a situation to be able to respond. So we are in a really tricky situation with the implementation of so much new technology, and making sure that people know its limitations, how to use it safely, correctly, that's a really important role for road safety officers, ADIs. And actually, if you go back to that safe systems idea, it covers loads of elements of it, safe speed, safe vehicles, safe road user, even safe emergency services. A lot of vehicles now will fire off a sort of a link to the emergency service to say that you've crashed. Your phone will do that for you, that sort of thing. So it's about understanding that whole picture, and ADIs have got a very, very important role to play in that.
Yeah. We'll be back with more from Ian in just a moment, but I want to give a shout to some of the latest sign-ups to the Instructor Podcast Premium, and they are Drew Duffy, Richard, Marcus Warwick, and Claire Vaughan. These guys get immediate access to the best on-demand resource available to driving instructors, with over 77 hours of exclusive content, including a brand new show that started this week with myself and Chris Spencer as we tackle all things theory test, and a brand new weekly series where I am covering all the key talking points from within our industry. So if you want access to the best value CPD around, then head over to www.theinstructorpodcast.com or check the link in the show notes. There are several different options to sign up. You can sign up for £10 or £22, but just a reminder that at the £10 tier, you can get a free week's trial. So sign up for a week, see if you like it. If you do, you can stay on the £10 monthly tier, and then further down the line, if you decide to upgrade again, you are more than welcome. And just a reminder, that's at www.theinstructorpodcast.com. But I also want to take a moment to thank Bright Coaching for sponsoring Season 7, and to find out more about Bright Coaching and their professional diploma for driving instructors, head over to brightcoaching.net. But for now, let's get stuck back into the show. I think it's about 100,000 people a year that pass a test, something like that. And it's, even if half of them paid attention to what we did on lessons, it's still a big number of people every year coming onto the road with a good background, and it's a new generation every year coming in, and I think I think if we can impact that, that's great. But I want to move on. Sorry, go on.
Okay, well, one you sort of asked about, ADIs in the road safety sector. One of the most important aspects of that is for road safety officers and ADIs to work really closely together, and in some areas that is done. So I'm involved with the scheme in the Northwest called Engage, and that's a scheme that really tries to work with ADIs to sort of promote what they do, to give them additional information they may not be aware of, and really support that process. And that partnership scheme has worked, I think, really quite well, and we've had some ADIs been involved with that for many years now, and I think they get a lot of benefit out of that. The benefit for the road safety teams is that they have a conduit to put through to learners, because they don't necessarily have that direct. Well, they don't have that direct contact with the learners, or very rarely. So I would love to see more schemes like that set up. I ran one in Huddersfield, and I think those schemes really do make a good partnership between ADIs and the local road safety team.
Yeah, good shout. I think is it Paul Mountford that does the Engage stuff? Is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So I think the other one that springs to mind when you're talking about that is the Honest Truth, and I know that the Road Safety GB recently did the online aging drivers course for instructors as well. And I think the interesting things about this is the number of instructors that don't take it up, that don't get involved in it. So I think I've asked a lot of people this question over this episode, and I'm going to ask you, and I think you're maybe in a slightly unique position, because you're obviously was an instructor for 15 plus years, and now you're heavily involved in this sector. Why do you think there is that gap between instructors and the road safety sector?
Oh, that's a nice question. Yeah, pretty tricky. I think some of it is a little bit historic. Traditionally, the road safety sector has tended to pick up the elements that weren't picked up by ADI. So pedestrian skills training, cycle training, wider campaigns on drink driving, those sorts of things. And So historically, I don't think road safety officers have ever thought, well, how can I work with driving instructors to develop things further? Some have, don't get me wrong, right? June Howlett, the Northwest team, hopefully when I was at Kirklees, myself, there's a huge range of people who have done, but just traditionally, that's not always been thought about. Road safety, and the same's probably a little bit true from ADIs as well. They've not really seen their role as being a larger role that fits with a larger road safety element. They have businesses to run, and generally, if they are involved in those things, they're asked to do it for free, and that sort of hurts financially, because it means that they're not gaining anything from it necessarily directly financially. And also, particularly over the last 15 years, 13 years, road safety budgets have been absolutely decimated. Large teams, road safety teams, have gone down from 8 or 9 people to 1, and in some cases none. So that then makes the road safety team go, right, or the road safety person go, right, what can I do? Where are my priorities? I can't instigate anything. I can just be a facilitator. And that's a real issue. Teams have been absolutely decimated, and a lot of the stuff that was done isn't necessarily done. So for example, we used to run an enhanced Pass Plus scheme, which included a new driver discussion group. The evaluation of that was really positive. It looked really as if it could have some legs. I left Kirklees, but within probably 24 months of me leaving, there was big cuts, and that really hit that scheme hard, and that doesn't run anymore. But that was a good scheme where ADIs used to come in. We would give them some training about, you'll be familiar with the goals for driver education, but it was a real new thing at that point. We would give them some training on that, a little bit of coaching training. It actually led to me being involved with Hermes, that project. And that was I always thought that was a really good scheme, but it cost money, and that money's just not there anymore, So I think that's probably part of it. So a bit historic, bit limited budget, that sort of thing. And sometimes, as you sort of said, I mean, the older driver, ADI, aging driver course, I designed that. My colleague Steve and Neil presented, but I did the research, the evaluation for it, and worked with Dave and Neil to research it and develop it to what it is, and we had 300 free places. It looks as if we filled them this time, but first time around when we only got 250. We really struggled to get 250. Timing perhaps wasn't great. It was over COVID and things like that. So, but it was a real struggle. But that's a good example actually of seeing road safety in a wider picture, because that's an area where driving instructors could really get involved. If you know the difficulties that older road users have, and by that I mean anybody over 50, really, right? Then you can start educating your drivers for what they can do to help them, what they need to watch for, what they need to consider, and as well as delivering it for the older driver as well, because we all share the road, and the more we know about the issues that other road users have, the more likely we are able to keep them safe and keep ourselves safe in some way as well.
I must admit that was something I took away from that course, the idea that you're not waiting until someone's old, you wait until they're aging, so that you're helping them almost transition into a different way of driving and deal with the problems that are upcoming. But I don't want to go down that road too much, because something you said there caught my attention. I mean, lots you've said today has caught my attention, obviously. But one thing in particular, you spoke about the goals driver education, and you said you'll be familiar with this. And it kind of stopped me a little bit, because I'm like, most instructors aren't.
Yeah.
And you saying that, then you'll be familiar with this. It's like I'm like that at times. I'll expect an instructor to be familiar with this. How important is it, in your opinion, that someone listening to this now, an instructor that isn't familiar with a Ghost Driver education, familiarizes himself with the GDE Matrix?
Well, I think it's really important. It was fairly pivotal for me in my development is in road safety when I first came across it. I was lucky enough to work with two of the authors of it, Mika Ataka, I think that's the correct pronunciation, and Esko Keskinen. So I was really lucky to work close with them. I had no input into the GDE, by the way. I just want to make that really clear. But I have worked with the two researchers on it at various times, and if you don't understand the GDE, then it's very difficult to prepare somebody for after the test, right? And I've always hated this. I don't know many driving instructors who just want to prepare somebody to pass the test. Most driving instructors I know, work really hard to give people a really good lesson, lots of different variety, lots of things. But there's a couple of key elements, and the first element is when you're in a car, you are in a training environment, right? And that is completely different to when you're not in that car, right? So, and when you're in that car, whether or not you like it or not, to a large degree, you are the controlling person in that car. If the people do something wrong, you will talk to them about it. You'll do it very nicely. You'll have a nice discussion. You'll lead them to the conclusion you want them to deem, and they'll go right. And they'll very soon twig that they have to conform to your view of driving, right? When they get out of the car, there's a lot of pressures that you can't really duplicate in a learning environment. The first pressure is, where are they going? Who are they going with? And why are they going there? So what we'll call goals for the journey, right? So the goal for the journey in a driving lesson is to drive well, right? The goal for a journey after that is to get from A to B, right? And they've got all the pressures linked to that, right? So it's very hard to prepare them for it unless you've thought about that before. You've then got their personality, goals for life, skills for living, having an influence. So that's a really important element, because suddenly their own levels of self-control, their impulse control, which I'm doing my PhD on, are to the fore now. So you're no longer there. You're no longer that controlling influence. So it's down to them, and they have to understand themselves. They have to understand when they're likely to make a bad decision, when they're likely to make a good decision, and not just related to, do I stop here? Do I go? But around drinking and driving, fatigue, which is a totally underrated issue for young drivers, massive impact on young drivers, mobile phone use, etc. So they all have to understand how their personality will dictate how they deal with those issues. And then at the top level, you've got the skills for social environment, which was the last level that was put up. And that's a really important one, because it sort of explains how they will be influenced in the whole. So I'll just give you a little example, if I may. So I'll use Alex, my eldest son. I'm going back quite a few years now. But when he was at university, he was doing sports science. He was in the football team. He was, everything was his whole life was dictated by university and sport. Okay, that was his social context, his social environment. All his friends were on the same course. So all his friends were about social, sport, all the rest of it. Personality type, well, Alex was a really good football player in his day. He had some trials with various clubs, didn't quite make it, but he was that sort of, level. And you don't get that good without having quite a competitive nature. So that's your personality, your goal. So he needed to understand how to control his competitive nature, when it's a good thing, when it's a bad thing. If you can't control it, make it competitive in some other way. So, if he saw his competitive nature as getting somewhere fast, that's bad. If he saw as, can I spot every hazard and react to it before I have to do anything suddenly, that's good. So getting him to think about that. And of course, the journeys he would take would be going to football matches with his friends, his players, having a group of young men in that car, and having that influence placed on him. So you can just see, and that then dictates how he deploys his perception skills, his speed choices, that sort of thing, and his car control. So it has this sort of really nice funnel effect. If you're only teaching hazard perception and car skills, you miss out all that top bit. And actually, that dictates whether or not they're going to crash afterwards as much as the car skills, or possibly even more, So understanding that whole GDE matrix is very important, really important. And understanding how you can influence that and get people to think about it. One of my favorite questions I ask pretty much most road safety, I deliver a lot of road safety training. I quite often ask a group, what does an amber traffic light mean? And they, as road safety professionals, stop unless it's unsafe to do so, stop unless you cross the white line. But basically the answer is stop. Brilliant, And then I sort of say, so what does it mean if you're late for a very important appointment? And they all look at the ceiling and go, what that gets, that's just applying a little bit of time pressure, and suddenly your decision-making process has changed. I'm not saying they would blatantly drive through that amber traffic light, but that 50-50 point where, well, do I keep going or should I stop? Suddenly probably 3 or 4 car lengths further back than it would be on a good day. So if you don't understand that, you can't get people to think about those issues when you're training them, which is all you can do to prepare them for the future, really.
An interesting example, because I know that I caught myself the other day, and I noticed that sometimes when I drive home, there's a set of lights just down from where I live. I don't always slow down as much towards those lights as I do with the other lights. And I realized it's because I'm nearly home. And I just, through these lights, turn right and I'm done. And I think it was a subconscious thing kicking in, and I noticed myself doing it. It's like, oh, that's interesting. But if I'd have just passed my test and I wasn't thinking about why I'm doing stuff because we'd not had those discussions, then I'm going to keep doing that. And if anything, it's going to get worse. And it probably did for the 10 years that before I become a driving instructor after passing. But for me, that's because I'm aware of this stuff. So I noticed myself doing it admittedly, probably after a couple of times. So I think that just shows the importance that we need to have these conversations and make people aware. And you made some really good examples there again. And I think that nicely brings us on to something else I wanted to mention today, which is the Hermes project. Because, do you know what? I'm going to ask you something now, which is probably a very, very unfair question. Summarize the Hermes project for me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, that's okay. Right. I can't do that very succinctly, but Hermes basically came out of 2 previous projects. Okay. I was already involved in the Hermes project. The first one was called the Gadget Matrix. The Gadget Project, and that produced the goals for driver education, right? So because originally the goals for driver education was called the Gadget Matrix. What then happened is there was another project which looked at, okay, we've got the goals for driver education. If you were going to design a sort of education program, what would it look? What would be best practice? I can't quite remember what that one was called. And then the final one was Hermes, which was, okay, right, what skills do somebody who was going to deliver that type of intervention would they need? And there was some pre-work done to Hermes. And that sort of said, well, actually, what you need is to encourage people to really think about themselves. And in fact, the right-hand column on the goals for driver education is self-evaluation self-evaluation, self-awareness. I can't remember, but it's that sort of thing. And really, the Hermes project was about thinking about how do you get people to be more self-aware and self-evaluate their own self in those instances. Because if you understand when you're likely to have weaknesses in your driving, you can do something about it, but only if you recognize that as a weakness. So impulsivity, you could argue some impulsivity is good, but some impulsivity is bad as well. So it's about knowing, So the one element of impulsivity is called non-planning. So it's about knowing, well, I'm not very good at planning things, right? So I've got to work really hard to plan, and by planning, I mean, planning my journey, what time am I going to go, preparing for the journey, preparing everything that's led up to the journey as well, because that will massively affect how I will make that journey. So it was all about that idea. It really was looking at developing a set of skills for driving instructors, driver trainers that would help them to encourage this self-evaluation process and self-reflective process. And that's really what Hermes was all about. How do you get people to be more reflective of their own practice? And I think that was the most important element of the Hermes project. Coaching doesn't fit everything. It doesn't fit every circumstance. It doesn't fit, but getting somebody to reflect is really important. And in fact, if you look at lots of things around education, just generally, you get, how do you make teachers reflect on the delivery that they've given in the classroom? How do you get your pupils to reflect on what they have learned and how it would influence them? How do you conceptualize that better for them? Because the danger in certainly all the ways of approaching driver training was it was done in isolation. You do this to pass your test. And now I'm not saying driving instructors ever said that. That doesn't matter. It's what the pupil thought, and somehow you've got to get them to think this is not just what I do to pass my test, but this is what I do all the time. And when will it be difficult for me to do that? And how am I going to sort of address that issue? And that's really what the Hermes project was about. It was about this self-reflective, active approach to the learning process that tried to push up to the higher levels of the GDE in particular. So your the social environment, goals for life, skills for living, and journey goal.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. And
Right.
but you mentioned there about instructors not saying, passing a test and so on. But I mean, literally today, I've read a review shared. I probably shouldn't say this, but whatever. I've read a review shared publicly by an instructor with a big chunk in the middle of this review from his learner saying, "And I'm especially grateful that he made me familiar with all the test routes." And it's just so disheartening. And I think this is what I wanted to ask you actually, because the Hermes project essentially led to client-centered learning. That phrase that I think most instructors are familiar with. But there's still a huge chunk of instructors that don't buy into that. And there are still training companies for instructors that don't teach client-centered learning or avoid it or do it as little as possible. So as someone that was involved in the Hermes project all those years ago, how do you feel about that? That still now there's still instructors that are arguing about that and not training that to PDIs?
Again, it's, you asked me about the introduction of things that might cause us to save systems and things. It's the same process, right? People are very reluctant to change, and it depends on what you see as being the outcome you're looking for. So a lot of my work now is evaluating things, and one of the hardest things is to know what to measure. Once you know what to measure, you can usually come up with some way of measuring it. And of course, a lot of ADIs will think, well, hang on, why do I need to change? Why do I need to do anything different? Because my pupils pass, right? Now, again, I'm not saying that they're only drive, they're trying to do a lot more than that. But actually, actually, I'm really successful. My pass rate is X, so I don't need to change. Other people might need to change, but I don't, right? So any change program requires a lot of motivation to do it. And that usually means giving people feedback on their performance. And that's actually quite difficult to do at sufficiently regular intervals for it to make much difference on somebody's performance, So we have the quality control done by DVSA, but, it's fairly irregular, and a lot of people are reluctant to accept the feedback they're given for a host of reasons. But it's not enough to make that sort of change. So it is about an education program, and I think it's important that is continually repeated and emphasized and highlighted. And also, one of the problems is the term client-centered. What the hell does that mean, right? That means lots of things to lots of people. I tried to sort of look at it quite a few years ago, and it basically means generally using some form of active learning technique. And by active, that doesn't mean necessarily driving the car. It means they're actively producing their own knowledge rather than just passively absorbing what you're giving them. And again, there's a bit of give and take in that process. And so the definition of active learning is actually quite problematic in itself, or sort of client centered. For me, my definition is, it's not really a definition. The most important aspect of learning something is feedback, right? So people have to be given feedback on their performance. So and the correct way of giving feedback is for it to start first with the client and then with the trainer. And that's quite often lost. So I'll give you just a daft example. I don't know if I'm sure I did this right. You pull up on the left. Oh, well done. You've done that left-hand turn really well there, haven't you? Yeah, I have. What do you think you could have improved? Well, you've already given them feedback. You've told them they've done it well, right? If you start off with, what did you think of that left turn? They have to start deciding whether or not it's right or wrong, right? So even praise is a form of feedback, and praise should always come out after the process. So if you really push me, what does client-centered mean? It means you start with feedback from the pupil and then you build on it. So forget about where they get their knowledge from and things like that. You've got to sort of work with that as well. But ultimately, it has to start client feedback first, then instructor feedback. And there's a piece of work done, and I can't remember the reference for it, unfortunately. Relatively old now, but it was a big what's called a meta-analysis of training. And they looked at schools. So this was nothing to do with road safety. And they found that the biggest indicator of a successful lesson at school was how the feedback was delivered. And if the feedback started with the pupil and then was built upon by the teacher, that was a sign of a high-performing school. But a lot of feedback that we give as ADIs tend to start with us. We tell them what we think. And the best example I can give of that is I did some work quite a few years ago within a driving school, and I was sat in the back, and I'd been sort of teaching that idea of starting with feedback from the pupil, and I can't quite remember the ins and outs of this, but basically the pupil was driving down the road. The pupil approached the problem a little bit quick. It was a parked car on our side of the road, oncoming traffic. He was a little bit late, starting to slow down. Not to the point where the trainer had to do anything, but just a bit late, so it was all a bit rushed. We then got around, and the trainer sort of the instructor looked at him and said, Fred or whatever his name was, what did you think to that? He said, oh yeah, should have speeded up there and got through, shouldn't I? And that told you more about his thought. That's what he was thinking about all the way down. Whereas if we'd sort of said, well done, you've done the right thing there, then that you wouldn't have got that feedback. And actually, that is the feedback that the trainer needs. Oh wow, he honestly thought he could get through there, and there was no way. Right? We need to sort of have a more in-depth chat of that. So it's this idea of starting client-centered learning. Start with feedback from the pupil, the trainer, and then go from there. And I think that's probably the definition of client-centered feedback learning. And if you're doing that, you're not going to be too far wrong. Obviously, there's loads of times when you've got to stop in to stop a crash and things like that. You don't say, well, what do you think to that? The lamppost hurtling towards us. Not good, But generally, where appropriate, that's the approach I would advocate.
I'm going to be really honest here, and I'm open to criticism for this, by the way. I reckon I probably do that about 90% of the time. And 10% of the time, I do what I call I let Terry out, and I can't help myself. I mentioned before about getting excited about stuff.
Yeah.
So let's use parallel park as an example. Student nails parallel park, does it awesomely. I'll start dancing. Next to car, and I'm like, that was awesome, well done. And I can't, it's like every now and again, I'm like, I got to let myself out now. And I'll give them that praise before I'm asking for feedback. So I would say 90% of the time, I'll say feedback first from them. And then 10% I'll let it slip from me. And that's just to accommodate me. What are your thoughts on that?
your 90-10 split's absolutely fine. For my first comment. Because sometimes the people just want a pat on the back.
Yeah.
But then you're given that reward for a motivation. Wow, well done, you've done that, brilliant. And so I don't really see a big issue with that. It's when that's been done consistently throughout the lesson that you're probably not gaining the insights that you need from what the learner thinks, of the process, or whoever you're training. It might not be a learner, So there's nothing wrong with occasionally saying, yeah, well done, God, you killed that. That was brilliant, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just, I'm a pragmatist, there has to be enough, you need a range of approaches in any lesson. And it's just getting that mix right for that pupil, and that's why I'm not, I'm not a slave to any one approach. In fact, one of the things I would say, which I've been very worried about for a number of years, is there is a slavish approach that this way is the only way. Well, I'm not convinced one way or the other with that. Coaching, fantastic, in the right place at the right time, in the right amount. Client-centered approaches that I've just outlined there, fantastic, in the right place at the right time, in the right amount. Other approaches, fantastic, in the right place at the right time, in the right amount. So it's very much about that mix, and that mix changes not just from pupil to pupil, but minute to minute. As the pupil gets tired, you probably want to tell them a little bit more than dragging it out of them because they begin to feel drained, and having to really, really think about something is just going to drain them even more. Or you might just want to give them a little break, so that they don't feel that it's 9 million questions or whatever, so it's never what approach, it's what makes.
I like it. Now, I've kept you for a long time, Steve, but is there anything else that you want to cover? Anything else you want to get across?
No, I hope that was all right. I hope, the people who listen to this will find it interesting. And, if I've said anything that's incorrect statistically, because, I'm dragging them out the back of my head, let me know. If anybody thinks it's wrong, drop me a note and I'll post the correct stat. I'm always worried about saying the wrong thing. I've not the best memory in the world. I usually like notes when I'm doing these things. But I've enjoyed it. I hope your listeners do.
Well, 84% of statistics are incorrect, so whatever works. But do you want to just take a moment to tell people where they can find you, or any projects you've got coming up, anything like that?
Okay. A couple of projects I've got coming up is just about to release a paper on impulsivity and the use of intelligent speed, assistance or adaptation. That was the other A I couldn't remember, if you remember. Assistance on speed. So that should be published in the next 2 or 3 months. So if you're interested in research, that's good. Best email address to get me on is Ian.Edwards@edrivingsolutions.com. So if you want to put that on anything, that's absolutely fine. I'm very happy to chat or talk about things. What other project have we got coming up? Doing a really interesting piece of work at the moment with Devon and Cornwall, which is moving fire and rescue service and the Zero Vision partnership down there. And that's moving away from fear and intimidation as a way of promoting behavioural change in young people. And that's been a really interesting big piece of work. And we'll be publishing some information on that fairly soon as well. And the other thing I would say is, and I know this costs ADI's money, and it's not the most well-paid profession in the world, and I certainly recognise that. But they may want to just think about doing some courses, outside of just the courses that you see advertised for training. So there's a host of road safety GB courses. But they may also just want to think about attending conferences. And if they really want to have a bit of an eye opener, it's an expensive conference, but they might want to look at the Road Safety GB National Conference. It is expensive, and I completely get that, but they will go away with their mind wizard, So if you're going to spend, I don't know what it is this year, 300 quid or whatever, 400 quid. If you want to spend 300 or 400 quid on your personal development, and then you could do a lot worse, and that will completely, I promise that. I went to Rosper used to run a big conference like that, and it was the first big conference I went to, and I was absolutely amazed. It was like a real light bulb moment going off in my head.
It's on my list. I think it's going to be a next year job for me, that one. But yeah.
It is pricey. It is pricey, and I completely get that. But if you're going to spend £500 on any course, then those 2 days might be quite good, and because it just gives you that little bit of everything. I think we've got something like 50 presenters, so you've got 50 different things that you can go and have a look at. Or also hear presentations on.
Well, I'll get links for that in the show notes and on the website blog when that goes out on the email. But yeah, big thank you for joining me today, and it's been fascinating.
Okay, no, absolute pleasure. All right, okay. Thanks ever so much, Terry. Hope to meet you again soon.
So a big thank you to Ian for joining me there. Really enjoyed that episode. Really enjoyable conversation, and he definitely opened my eyes to a few things and helped me connect some dots. But I want to take a little moment here to do something I don't normally do, and that's just acknowledge a little bit of pride that I've got, because I recently attended the ADI NJC and Intelligent Instructor Convention, and at that convention, they grouped the speakers into groups of 3. And one of the groups of 3 was Dr. Elizabeth Box, Ian.Edwards, and Ollie Taylor. And I can remember sitting there with a little smile and just being quite proud that these guys have been on the podcast. At the time I was watching them, Ian had recorded, but we hadn't released it yet. But it'd been on the podcast, and it just got me thinking a little bit that these guys present all over. They present at the expo, the convention, but they also present at things like Young Driver Focus and the Road Safety GB conference. The really high national events, and then the international events as well. These guys they've gone to BBC News and Sky News and all this stuff, and they're always willing to come and talk to me on this podcast. Now, I'm not saying that's a me thing. I think it's just how giving they are with their time. But there's definitely some pride there for me that, I've been able to sit down with the likes of Ian.Edwards and Liz Box and Ollie Taylor and take hours of their time. Today's recording went on for over an hour and a half. I edited a big chunk out just to make it fit better. So, I just wanted just to share a little bit of pride there of how, grateful I was sitting there at that convention, just listening to these 3 brilliant people talk and thinking, I've had some really, really cool conversations with these people, and they're willing to do it again. And I think that we as instructors should be a little bit grateful that these guys are willing to come and do this for free for us and share their time and share their wisdom and their knowledge. And maybe that's something we can be better at as well, at reaching out to them and seeing how we can help them rather than always waiting for them to come to us and see how they can help us. Maybe there's a balance to be had there somewhere. I'm not sure, but that's something I'm going to be talking about a bit more in the next episode, because we are coming to the end of season 7 here. And yeah, like I said, just really proud of what we've done in this season. Like I said, look at the people we've had on. I mentioned the 3 there, but also likes of Rebecca Morris and James Lucas and Lucy Straker and others who I haven't mentioned. Just really chuffed to have these guys on. But I also want to give a special shout out, in particular this week, as I say, we come towards the end of season 7. Particular shout out to Bright Coaching for sponsoring the show, and in particular Stuart Lockery. And I'll explain why specifically. Because Bright Coaching sponsoring this show has enabled me to produce a better season. Now, I've been really chuffed for everything I've done previously. Really proud of all my previous work, but Bright Coaching come on board has given me some extra tools to use to produce better content. And that's part of the reason why I agreed for Bright Coaching to sponsor, because I have had offers of sponsorship in the past, and they've all been politely declined, because I don't want the Instructor Podcast just to be used as a marketing tool for someone else. I wanted someone to come on board that actually wanted to help the show as well. And that's what Stuart Lockie wanted to do. It was one of his biggest reasons, in fact. He wanted to support the show. He wanted to support me. He wanted to help me get this information out. And, I'm ridiculously grateful for that. And yeah, just, big thank you to Stuart and Bright Coaching for sponsoring the show. And again, we may talk about that a bit more in next week's episode. But if you want to find out more about Bright Coaching, just head to brightcoaching.net. And I'm going to ask you all to do a really big favor. If you have enjoyed this season of the podcast, I'm asking for a favor right now. Go and sign up to the Bright Coaching newsletter, brightcoaching.net, www.brightcoaching.net, or you can find a link in the show notes and you sign up to a newsletter there. Now, there's been a few thousand people that have listened to this season. I would love it if you all signed up to their newsletter. That is a little thank you to me. That's a favor you can do for me for this season. But I also want to mention one more time about Road Peace, because yes, I can usually take this opportunity to promote the Instructor Podcast Premium. And yes, you can go sign up there in £10 tier, £22 tier. But I would love it if this week you donated to Road Peace. I said about it at the start of the show. You can go find out more online. You can find out more on the episode I did with Rebecca Morris at the start of this season. But if you have a few quid to spare, please take a moment to donate to Road Peace. Even if you wanted to sign up to the Instructor Podcast Premium and ask me to donate your membership this week to Road Peace, then you'll get all the stuff from the Instructor Podcast Premium, and I will also donate that money to Road Peace. Just sign up and drop me a message, and I'll do that if that's what you want me to do for this week. But you'll find links for that in the show notes, or as I mentioned, you can head to www.theinstructorpodcast.com. But all that's left for me to say is let's keep raising standards.
The Instructor Podcast with Terry Cook, talking with leaders, innovators, experts and game changers about what drives them.
Are you planning on like a Costa coffee today, or a Big Mac, or fish and chips, or something like that? Yeah, Sunday treat. Maybe today you drop your Sunday treat and instead use that money to donate to Road Peace. Link in the show notes.